Good morning. Power, his party and Parliament. Does the Prime Minister have the strength to get all of Brexit done?
I am a Conservative, a Brexiteer and a Unionist, and any agreement that we reach needs to tick all three boxes.
Hear that? Let me finish Brexit, the Prime Minister proclaims. A final deal to smooth out tensions over Northern Ireland does now feel seriously close.
I think the talks on reforming the protocol are inching towards a conclusion.
Yet, shock horror, the Conservative Party might be hard to convince.
Ignore the howls of indignation from those on his side who will never take yes for an answer. Why doesn't he just get on with it?
Brexit trade frictions and freezing temperatures in Morocco are just two of the reasons behind this. Empty shelves and limits on what we can buy in the shops. The Environment Secretary ended up suggesting we savour homegrown veg instead.
It's important to make sure that we cherish the specialisms that we have in this country. A lot of people would be eating turnips right now.
Tempted by turnips? The bigger question for us this morning, can Rishi Sunak tempt his party and the Northern Irish Unionists to back his likely deal?
Dominic Raab, the Prime Minister's number 2 and fellow Brexiteer, is here. But how would Labour approach those Brexit talks? The man who'd be Labour's Foreign Secretary is with us as well, David Lammy. And the race to replace Nicola Sturgeon as Scotland's First Minister is on. The Scottish Health Secretary and wannabe SNP leader Humza Yousaf joins us live. And with me at the desk, the boss of the Civil Servants Union, Dave Penman. Thomasina Miers, cook, writer and restaurateur, who has plenty to say about those empty shelves. And George Eustice, who knows a thing or two about the food industry as the former Environment Secretary. Good morning and thank you for joining us. Now, a deal on Northern Ireland's post-Brexit rules is genuinely close. It might be unveiled tomorrow. And the agreement, as we understand it, is broadly done. But there's a different question. Will Rishi Sunak have the authority to get the deal over the line with his party? There's lots of speculation on that on the front pages. Let's take a look. He promises to the Sunday Times to be the Prime Minister who will get Brexit done. But the Mail has a different line, Conservative anger over how the King got involved in all of this, if indeed that did happen. Some of the other papers, The Observer, a disturbing story about the number of the police who face criminal charges. The Sunday Mirror has the story of a Ukrainian boy, but an interesting story we'll get to later on the front page of the Sunday Herald in Scotland. Muslim leaders will not endorse Humza Yousaf, who we'll be speaking to a bit later, and praise Kate Forbes, one of the other candidates, for talking openly about her religion. So there's a lot to talk about this morning, but let's get on with our panel. Welcome to all of you. George, here we are again, your party poised once more to do battle over Brexit. We're expecting a deal, but we're also expecting a lot of argument. Do you think Rishi Sunak has got the authority to get a deal past his party?
Well, I'm certainly quite open to this because I was part of Boris Johnson's government that came up with something called the Command Paper in August 2021, put together by Lord Frost, and a number of us contributed to that. It was a very good proposal, comprehensive proposal. It dealt with the EU's legitimate concerns, but it also had no truck with some of their sort of illegitimate game playing and banning seed potatoes, for instance, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And if what Rishi's managed to do is to land an agreement that's in that sort of territory, we should absolutely get behind it, because that's what Boris Johnson would have done, it's what Liz Truss would have done, it's what Theresa May would have done, and that's what we should do.
Now, it's interesting, because you were a Brexiteer, so those who are bellyaching already, you're suggesting should get behind it.
Well, I think they should be much more open-minded to it. You know, we have to stop thinking that if there's a deal that's about to be done, it means we've been done over in some way. It could be that actually the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which was an entirely legitimate response to EU poor behaviour and intransigence and a surly approach to these sorts of...
It was very controversial, though. Not everybody agrees it was reasonable.
There are twitchy lawyers who take a different view to me on this, but actually, if the EU, as they were saying, We're not going to even assess your sea potatoes. We're going to ban the English oak from being sold in Northern Ireland. We're not going to sort of engage in the withdrawal agreement in the spirit it was intended. Then that was a legitimate response.
Well, let's see. Lots of twitchy lawyers, might be lots of twitchy Tories as well. Now, Thomasina, as well as people will know you from MasterChef, but also you run a big business. You've got 13 restaurants around the country. When you listen to all this sort of politicking, and part of the impact of that has been empty shelves we've seen this week, how does it affect you when you're trying to get on with running a company?
Well, what I find frustrating about government is there's never a whole approach. So to talk about food, which is linked to climate, biodiversity, health, public health, which now costs us £74 billion a year, poor health, which is diet related. And there's no coherence of government, and we need systematic change. There's a time bomb we're sitting on in our food system, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. If we think cucumbers and tomatoes are bad, we are looking at way worse in the next decade.
That's fascinating, and later on we'll get the two of you to discuss that, because of course, George, as Environment Secretary, you were running that whole kind of system. Dave, this government, as we've already heard in a couple of minutes, has got a lot of challenges. But you represent many of the people who work for the government, and you found they've got a lot of challenges too. What's your union doing?
Yeah, so we've surveyed the senior civil service. That's told us that 1 in 6 have got concerns about the inappropriate conduct of ministers, bullying and harassment. Over 70% don't trust the system to deal with that. And the Prime Minister's had a chance to do something about this. He's refused to do so. He's refused to introduce an independent process for dealing with this. So we've written to the Health and Safety Executive calling for them to conduct an investigation.
But some of our viewers listening this morning think, look, politics is a tough business. People work under high pressure, they work under high stress. Is it really that bad?
Well, that's what our members are saying to us. They're telling us about the conduct of ministers. The scale of it is quite daunting. We're talking, as I say, about 1 in 6 in the last 12 months reporting inappropriate conduct from ministers across over 20 government departments. Civil servants are work at the heart of government as well. They know it's tough. They work 7/24 as well. So the fact that they're calling this out, I think, indicates we've got a really serious problem.
OK, we'll talk more about the findings of your research a bit later on. All three of you, thank you very much for now, but more hard work for you later on. And of course, we want you to be involved in our conversations here as well. We love hearing from you, and your emails, your tweets on the hashtag BBC Laura Kay or emails at kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk are part of our conversation too. But first, some have called it a really nasty hangover from the Brexit talks, sorting out the protocol we've just been talking about, those post-Brexit trading arrangements. Now, they matter practically if you live in or do business with Northern Ireland, where businesses are bound by some different trade rules so that the border with Ireland could be kept open. But this issue also matters symbolically a great deal for Rishi Sunak and the government, desperate to move on from the whole Brexit conversation which has divided the Conservative Party. But can he? Well, Dominic Raab is Rishi Sunak's number 2, and he's with us this morning. And former Brexit Secretary, of course, is on your CV. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it we're going to see a deal in the next few days?
I'm not sure I'd put it on a scale of 1 to 10. There are always different bits of the jigsaw that need to be put in place. And you know, Laura, we've been talking about this for years. There's no deal done until the whole deal's done. But I think we've made progress. And the critical area where we've made progress is, and you talked about the issues affecting businesses, not just businesses from one community, but all communities in Northern Ireland, in doing that critical trade with the rest of Great Britain, is to make sure that we shift away, as the command paper that George Eustice talked about, from approach which is checking every consignment going in from Britain to Northern Ireland to what's called an intelligence-based approach. So if there's a real problem and it looks like goods are going on from Northern Ireland, they are checked, but we don't have, if you like, a tick box approach. Likewise, just to complete the piece, I think if we can move and persuade the EU, as we've been trying for years, to, in terms of protecting their equities, which we recognise, to a market-based surveillance approach, which effectively means they look at what's happening in the Republic with goods that go to Northern Ireland in case there's a risk of them going into the wider single market. And if we can achieve that, it will be a massive win.
But it sounds like both sides are pretty resolved now that there is a deal there to be done that has pretty much been done. But it's harder then, potentially, for you to get it through your party. If there is a deal, can you confirm to your colleagues and also to our viewers that MPs will have a say? There will be a proper vote on a deal?
Yes, MPs will will have the opportunity to express themselves on the deal.
So there will be a vote, to be completely clear. That won't be just a debate or a nod through. There will be an actual vote.
I don't think anything ever gets nodded through Parliament. Look, the reality is the details will be brought forward in the usual way. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. I understand what you say, and there is a degree of quiet confidence about the progress being made, but we're not there yet.
But there will be a vote.
Parliament will have its ability to express itself.
If the DUP, who the Northern Irish Unionists who've been most concerned about all of this, don't vote for the deal, will you withdraw it?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. I'm confident.
It's a hypothetical question. It's a practical, real question that confronts
because
you
you're
right
saying
now.
if we get a deal, if the DUP, I'm not going to get in the ifs and buts game. What I can tell you where we are right now, talk to the facts I know. There's been a shift in the approach. We recognise the equities of the EU, the legitimate ones, but I think it's also fair to say that they've moved. This approach to intelligence-based checks, not tick box for every consignment, market surveillance, and I think also a critical issue of this is going to be, you know, at the start we talked about what's the impact on businesses, also consumers in Northern Ireland of all communities. I think if there are any new rules that would apply in relation to Northern Ireland, it must be right that there's a Northern Irish democratic check on that. And again, that would mark a significant shift in the paradigm of the arrangements. And I think that's good news.
But some of your colleagues wonder why, with the Conservatives pretty consistently now 20 points behind in the polls, with their questions therefore about Rishi Sunak's authority, they wonder why he's picking this kind of fight. I mean, is it naive or is it unusually courageous?
Are you talking about it as if the politics should define this? This is a question of
the politics will decide whether or not you can do this.
Of course, and doing the right thing the right way for all communities in Northern Ireland, protecting the Good Friday Agreement, which has come under pressure from the Northern Ireland Protocol. Frankly, if you ask about the politics, fulfilling our manifesto commitment on Brexit. I think in all those three areas, what the Prime Minister is seeking to do as a statesman is get the deal that will resolve these issues, particularly whether it's for businesses, whether from whichever community, but also the average citizen in Northern Ireland in the shops as a consumer.
And you've made that point, but the politics of it, like it or not, and many of our viewers might find it very frustrating, the politics of it do determine whether or not it will come to pass. Now, we all remember 2018. This is what did for Theresa May. You resigned over this as Brexit Secretary. Do you and Rishi Sunak think it's going to be easy this time?
It was never easy, but as you say, I resigned over the deal, including explicitly, if you look back at my resignation letter, my fears about the Northern Ireland Protocol. This would be, if we can get it over the line, we're on the cusp, we've made great progress, we're not there yet, but it would be a really important deal, and just critically, a deal that, with all the best will in the world and for all the progress that others have made, that no Prime Minister before had been able to secure. So yes, I think it would mark a paradigm shift, first and foremost, for the communities in Northern Ireland, but I think it would be a significant achievement.
For Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, and are you confident that he can get it through the Conservative Party if the deal is done with Brussels?
Well, I never like to make predictions. What I would say is talk to what's in the deal, because I think that's what folks will want to hear, colleagues, members of the public, the communities in Northern Ireland. And as I said, I've given you three examples. The democratic lock, if you like, that the institutions of Northern Ireland would have, the approach to intelligence-based approach to goods between GB and Northern Ireland, where there's a risk of onward transmission.
And you've made that point, and you think it will be good enough.
Well, this is what
I noticed you don't want to make yourself a hostage to fortune.
But actually, these are the things that myself, George Eustice, other Brexiteers, dare I say the ERG, and politicians in Northern Ireland have been calling for. So I think the key thing is deliver on those imperatives, and then hopefully we can persuade people, get people on side.
Okay. Now, the Civil Servants Union, we've just heard today, is claiming that nearly 70% of senior civil servants have no faith that a complaint about a minister's conduct would be dealt with fairly. Is there a problem between ministers and officials?
So first of all, we've got zero tolerance for any bullying, and it's the job of ministers with their permanent secretary to make sure, department by department, that's the case. And of course, and I understand that you'll refer to my own situation, what I would say, and I've been minister in a whole range of departments, Secretary of State, as Foreign Secretary, as Brexit Secretary, as Justice Secretary, actually, the vast majority of the time, the relationship is excellent. Obviously, ministers are there to take responsibility, to direct, to bring challenge, but in a professional and respectful way. But we can't do it without the civil servants. I started off life as a Foreign Office lawyer, 6 years. So I'm not here to criticise the civil service. They're absolutely essential. So that relationship is critically important.
But
by and large, the majority of the time, it works very effectively.
Is there a problem? Because the FDA is now asking the Health and Safety Executive to investigate whether the civil service is a safe place to work. Is there a problem?
Well, that's their prerogative. We'll look, of course, at the surveys he's referred to. I don't think there's an institutional systemic problem, but it's incumbent on ministers with our permanent secretaries. I know I've done it with mine in the Ministry of Justice, but across the board, to try and make sure that relationship is as effective as possible. And my message to the many civil servants I work with every day, who do an incredible job and who we have a great relationship, ministerial challenge, candour from them, is actually we're at our very best when we're big in the sum of our parts. That's the way the business of government gets done for the viewers watching this show.
Now, you've already referenced your own case. There is an investigation into complaints about some of your behaviour as a minister. Now, one of our viewers has emailed us, Michael Wright, to ask, is Dominic Raab a bully? Are you?
No.
You're confident in that?
Yes.
Can you imagine any situation where any of the officials you worked with might have gone home at the end of the day and felt that your behaviour had been unacceptable?
Well, I hope not, but you're impinging on what is now the subject of an inquiry. Allow me to, as I called for it, to be respectful of it and not get into any of the detail of that.
Well, I'm asking you, though, a human question, really, and you must know the answer to this. I mean, as somebody who works in a very stressful environment,
sure,
very high-pressured jobs, have you ever felt, when you've gone home at the end of the day, maybe I shouldn't have raised my voice, or maybe I shouldn't have reacted in that way? Have you ever had one of those moments? I think most of us would have feel, oh, maybe I didn't handle that very well. Have you ever had that?
Look, in terms of working style, falling short of any of the impropriety you referred to, look, of course we learn lessons as we go. And that's part of the relationship with civil servants. But I'm confident that I behave professionally throughout. And as I say, I think actually the vast lion's share of the time, the vast majority of cases and the time we spend together, civil servants and ministers work very effectively together.
But you once said, when you were Brexit Secretary, I think, you said, I say the things that no one dares to. Now, maybe that's a good thing. Should there be more plain speaking in politics?
Yes, absolutely. And what we need, and I think this can be reconciled absolutely with having a zero tolerance of bullying. You need ministers that come in and that correctly, but directly challenge assumptions, test ideas. That's the way we get the best out of government.
So some ministers should behave more like you, be more direct, be more bold.
I wouldn't be quite so immodest, but I do think we serve your viewers. It's critically important. And if I look at the job I'm doing at the moment, whether it's working with the government on the Northern Ireland Protocol, whether it's the big challenge of driving up convictions in rape cases, we've seen a 2/3 increase. I look at the victims bill, the parole reforms. We do need to have some pretty direct conversations, but I'm very confident to deliver for the British people, for the victims of crime and all the rest of it. But of course that can be reconciled with being respectful and professional.
But what's the difference between being demanding and being demeaning? Because there are many people who have spoken to newspapers or spoken to the BBC that you have worked with in the past who feel that you have crossed a line.
Yeah, well, look, I'm not going to comment on matters that are subject to an investigation. And frankly, it's not really right for anyone that's worked in that context. We're going talking to the media, but that's for the inquiry to deal with. We've got that inquiry set up so it can deal with these matters in an impartial, independent way. I'm fully cooperative with it. Indeed, I called for it, but allow me to respect it.
And have you spoken to Adam Tolley, who's carrying out the investigation?
No, I understand what you're doing, typically what any journalist would do, but allow me to respect it.
We're asking questions on behalf of the
Sure,
audience.
but allow me to respect an independent inquiry. I think you know that is the proper thing for me to do.
OK, lastly, I want to ask you about a case which relates to your job as Justice Secretary. Now, this weekend, the family of Joanna Simpson, who was killed in horrific circumstances by her ex-husband, Robert Brown, there's an image of her there. Her family have called on you to block his early release from prison. Now, he served half of a 26-year sentence. And we actually have a question for you from Joanna's mother, Diana Parks,
Yeah.
and we can show it to our viewers there. Diana's asking, why is he being automatically released halfway through his sentence without being mentally assessed first? That was a key part of his case. And please, she is asking, can you meet with her so she can explain in person why the case has gone so wrong? So just straightforwardly, would you be willing to meet Diana?
Oh yes, of course, and I meet lots of victims or bereaved in these appalling cases. This case isn't coming up until later in the year. Within the powers I've got, I would look at this as I would look at any other very rigorously. Again, allow me to avoid prejudicing any decision. But this is one of the reasons, Laura, that we increase sentencing in the Police Court Sentencing and Crime Act. Disappointed Labour blocked it. It would have dealt with, we'd have an increase in sentencing in exactly this kind of case. That's why I'm bringing forward, and very shortly, reforms to the parole process, because my job is always to put victims first, so of course I'll meet with her, and secondly, to protect the public.
And are you sympathetic to blocking the release of her daughter's killer?
I'd risk being judicially challenged if I started to prejudice the decision I will make later. But I think across the board, people have noticed a change since I've come in as Justice Secretary, scrutinising exceptionally carefully, for example, moves into open conditions from the closed estate and also parole decisions. And I've also been clear, I don't think the powers are adequate at the moment, which is why we'll be bringing forward legislative proposals to reform that shortly. And I hope that's something that would have widespread support. You might ask David Lammy. I hope he will and Labour will get behind those reforms.
OK, Dominic Raab, thank you so much for coming in this morning and answering a range of questions on different issues. Now, let's see what our trio at the desk made of all of that. Dave Penman, you heard there, Dominic Raab answering questions about bullying in the civil service and also about his own case, which for reasons you might understand he didn't want to get into. What did you make of what you heard?
Well, the picture he paints is that everything's fine in the civil service and the relationship between ministers and civil servants is OK. That's not the picture that civil servants speak of. That's not their experience. Come back to the point, 1 in 6 are saying that they've experienced bullying or harassment or witnessed that in the last 12 months alone across 20 government departments. And they don't have the confidence of challenging those behaviours.
Well, let's share some of the comments that your survey gathered with our viewers. One civil servant has reported swearing and a minister being aggressively critical with no right of reply. Another said that one of the ministers is monstrous and that nobody should have to put up with such a humourless slave driver. Now, those sound like people feeling terrible things and terrible anxiety around work. But politics is a very high pressure business. And from time to time, people working under great pressure, under great stress and responsibility might not behave in an ideal way. Are you really saying to our viewers this morning that it is that bad?
Well, that's what civil servants are telling us. Civil servants work in that high-pressure environment. The sort of people who get to work with ministers are the people at the top of their career. Many of them are hand-picked for that job. They know what it's like to work at the heart of government. They understand those pressures, and they also know the difference between a minister that's respectful of their professional opinion and their role as a civil servant and a bully.
But viewers, though, heard there Dominic Raab say, actually, he's working for the public. There's nothing wrong with having high standards. He even said more people should be plain speaking.
Well, plain speaking is different from bullying. I mean, one of the things that came out in our survey as well is that because of the humiliating, demeaning behaviour that people are reporting, they're not actually giving ministers the advice that they need. The ability to speak truth unto power, which is critical for the civil service. It's the point of having an impartial and permanent civil service, is to give ministers that best advice. If that minister is aggressive, is rude, is humiliating, is demeaning to you, are you going to give them that sort of advice, the very advice that they need? Well, the survey suggests that that's not the case. And the Prime Minister knows about this. The Prime Minister is aware, as previous Prime Ministers have been as well. The Committee for Standards in Public Life has recommended that an independent process is introduced to regulate these issues, because just now it requires a Prime Minister to agree to even an investigation happening. And what civil servants are saying is that they have no confidence if they do challenge that behaviour, anything will be done about it.
But just lastly on this, and then I want to see if it matches with any of George's experiences in government. This has been an extraordinarily turbulent period in politics. Do you think the situation has actually got worse, or are you now uncovering what was already going on? Or maybe perhaps also there's a generational change because people perceive behaviours in different ways.
certainly from the comments from members in the survey, it feels like it's got worse. I think if you look at what's happened over the last few years, people have known, particularly under Boris Johnson, that there was a Prime Minister who would do nothing about it. Remember, this entire system of challenging ministerial behaviour lies with the Prime Minister. You can't even get an investigation unless the Prime Minister agrees it, and only the Prime Minister makes a decision. Dominic Raab talked about an independent investigation. There might be someone independently investigating and establishing the facts, but it's not someone independent who makes a decision on it. So I think things have got worse, and certainly that's what members are telling us.
OK, George, you were a minister for a long time. Does this ring true?
Well, not in my case, but I had a particular, approach to these things, which is, first of all, in meetings, I would always try and get some of the more junior civil servants, often who had their head under the towel on an issue, into meetings and engage them. And it was really important to try to put them at ease, and so not to be aggressive, even if you were frustrated, to actually try and encourage them to open up. And so, yes, I would say provocative things to try to provoke a response, but there isn't an excuse really for getting angry or aggressive with people. So otherwise you don't get the best out of them, and if there's a problem and something goes wrong, they don't volunteer it.
But what about colleagues? Because, Westminster is the classic rumour mill. There are always there's a kind of body of knowledge. Did you, and I'm not going to ask you to name names, but did you at times hear about some of your colleagues behaving badly or in ways that they shouldn't have done?
Well, look, I'm not going to get into, because obviously everyone's an individual and different ministers will have different approaches.
So yes,
and yes, if you were to talk to civil servants, they would have ministers that they enjoyed working with and ones that they enjoyed working with less. But, on the basis, I don't think the answer is some sort of independent sort of body to be set up. The truth is that the best person to take a minister aside and say, look, you're not handling this correctly, you're allowing the stress of the job to get you, is actually the Secretary of State. And if the permanent secretary in a department talks to the Secretary of State and says we have a bit of a problem with one of your ministers, that person's the best to do it. And if it's a bigger problem than that, well actually then, the Cabinet Secretary, somebody close to the Prime Minister, a Chief of Staff, are actually in a much more powerful position to correct that behaviour.
Dave, what do you make of that?
Well, that's failed. That system has failed. That's the current system. The kind of good chat principle that at some point you get to a Prime Minister who would do something about it. The previous Prime Ministers have made it absolutely clear that that's not the case, as we saw with the investigation into the Home Secretary. Time and again, that's cited in our survey. They say there is no point raising a complaint because no one will address it. Permanent secretaries don't have the confidence to challenge it because a Prime Minister will not back them. And that's the problem. All of this relies on a Prime Minister doing the right thing. And if a Prime Minister won't do the right thing, the entire system falls apart.
George?
Well, all I would say, if any, if my permanent secretary had ever said to me, look, we've got a problem, a genuine problem with one of your ministers, and it's not just a personality trait that they have, this is actually causing stress, and I would always have taken those. I used to meet my ministers weekly to address these
that very seriously. OK, right, let's talk about Brexit. And the Prime Minister's been busy writing pieces for friendly newspapers about how he's going to get this deal and it's going to be great, or he hopes he's going to get this deal. We can see the Sunday Telegraph, I think he's in there, and he's also done an interview with the Sunday Times, and he's been all over the place this morning saying it's all going to be fine. From what you heard Dominic Raab say, George, do you think that your colleagues will back the deal we think that Rishi Sunak has?
Well, I think to be fair to all of them, and me included, we have to wait and see exactly what's proposed. But if the speculation's right and it's about green lanes and red lanes and so on, and no requirement for paperwork when goods are going just to Northern Ireland, that's actually very close to what we had proposed way back in August 2021 in the days of Boris Johnson. And
surely
so we should get behind.
That weren't said to be impossible have now magically become possible because the politics is a bit different, perhaps?
Well, I think to be fair, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill may have flushed out the European Union and addressed some of their intransigence in this area.
Well, we'll see what happens.
There are still some issues. There's the role, for instance, I'm a little bit nervous about the role of the ECJ. Even EEA members like Norway have an EFTA court rather than the ECJ, and it's a court with a political dimension. So there are those sorts of issues.
Maybe one day we'll be able to stop talking about all these acronyms. I mean, Thomasina, you run a business. Brexit has been a big factor for people for all sorts of reasons. And this week, then, we've seen these pictures of empty shelves in our supermarkets, which is partly down to Brexit, partly down to freak weather in Morocco, partly down to all sorts of things. So it can't just be pinned on Brexit at all. But how do you feel this situation has been handled? Because empty shelves haven't just suddenly appeared, have they?
Well, I think the main problem is the empty shelves. I mean, it seems to be a massive surprise to us all that they're empty, but no one's really admitting that our current food system is completely broken. Yeah, there's a propaganda that the food system somehow miraculously provided cheap food for all. But the very system which it depends is rife with insecurities, whether it's to do with climate, biodiversity or public health. So I mentioned public health and how much it's costing the taxpayer, but it's also killing people now. The food we eat, diet-related disease, is killing people more than smoking or alcohol, and no one is really addressing that. We have this problem with our food culture, and I think it's really propounded by government, who seem to think that good food is a luxury. And we take food in schools. We've listened a lot about people, kids from low incomes not being able to afford free school meals. The travesty is that the food in most schools is absolutely awful. And the work we've done at Chefs in Schools, a charity we set up 4.5 years ago, has shown it's perfectly possible to feed people great food at a really reasonable cost.
But when you say our food system is broken, what do you actually mean by that?
Well, the way we farm is incredibly oil intensive, and it contributes to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the way we farm not only contributes to the carbon warming, but also is degrading our soils. So unless we get behind the farmers and support them in new modern ways of agriculture, so regenerative farming, there are lots of myths about it. It's not rewilding. It's not going back to a kind of era of like bucolic small fields and kind of donkeys. It's using amazing technology, like amazing companies have got tiny light robots, and it's feeding the masses. People like Wild Farmed are now producing regeneratively grown wheat for Marks and Spencer's, Burger King, Nando's in a planetary friendly way, helping to bring back that biodiversity.
Now, George, you were Environment Secretary for a long time, and you've heard Thomasina say that the food system is broken. And also this week, the National Farmers Union has said that basically we've got market failure. I mean, from what Thomasina says, is you've made a right old mess of this, haven't you?
I agree with some of what Thomasina said. In fact, I'm a massive advocate of regenerative agriculture and put in place the policies to deliver it. But look, what's really going on here is, first of all, we've got a cocktail of weather events that have been the trigger for this. But underlying that, two really big things. One is that food prices have always been intrinsically linked to energy costs, because fertilizers, gas, tractor fuel, all of this is linked, to the cost of energy. So when you have a massive spike in energy, food prices follow typically 3 to 4 months later. And if it's a really big spike, as we've seen, you start to get supply chain shortages. And that's because everybody basically goes a little bit closer to the wire than they normally would, because they can't afford the certainty. So businesses use less fertilizer, scale back production, delay planting in greenhouses. Supermarket buyers take risks they wouldn't otherwise take on more primitive production systems in Spain. And then you get these sorts of problems coming out in the wash.
Thomasina?
But then these farming methods you're talking about, George, are so planetary unfriendly, and they're creating the weather systems that are causing these shortages. So we're not going to get less of these extreme weather, we're just going to get more of them as the planet hottens up. So why isn't government supporting farmers to do a better thing more? I mean, there's been such a slow delay on giving any farmers a visibility on what we're going to do with elms. It's just been too slow, and we've got to put more money in it. We've got to invest in better food.
That's the direct payments.
I know they say that. I don't accept that, though. We've now got nearly half of farmers in something called countryside stewardship doing exactly the sort of regenerative agriculture, things like herbal lays and so on that Thomasina talks about. We've made huge progress over the last 2 years. More's being done. There's new modules of something called the Sustainable Farming Incentive that I designed while in office that Therese Coffey's committed to. So we're making good progress.
George, is that you've got newspapers this morning mounting campaigns called Save Our Salad. You've got a farming minister hauling the supermarkets in tomorrow. I understand that there's conversations in government about whether or not the limits on quotas of bringing vegetables in from other countries should even be lifted. This is not a small problem.
Well, look, the reality is that there isn't much different that the government could have done in recent months, and there's nothing they can do immediately. We're going to have 3 or 4 weeks of this, and the supermarkets have got to work to get it right. But longer term, there are things we should be doing. We had a new strategy on food last July. We should be committing to onshore production. So glasshouse production of cucumbers and tomatoes, we should be trying to build that here. We should have a more enlightened approach to labour so that food can get access to labour.
Well, and yes, all things that the Farmers Union would say they've been calling for a while. But let's move on, because we've got
provided
lots
for
to
them in our Agriculture Act.
I also want to give Thomasina some warning that many of you might have heard the Environment Secretary talk about turnips this week and suggesting we should cherish our homegrown veg. I know turnips aren't necessarily at the top of many people's menus. So as one of the country's most famous chefs, your challenge for the end of the programme is to come up with a tasty turnip suggestion for our viewers. Now, the Tories are highly likely, as we've been hearing, to have a torrid few days on Brexit. What's new, you might wonder? But the question isn't completely straightforward for their opponents either. After starting this week by announcing Labour's 5 big missions, Keir Starmer has said that he would vote for the deal that Rishi Sunak is expected to bring back from Brussels, if it emerges, of course. But if Labour was in power, how would it handle the relationship across the Channel? Well, one of the people who knows a thing or two about that is David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, and he joins us in the studio for the first time, I believe, actually. David, welcome to you. First of all, do you want to praise Rishi Sunak for actually trying to sort all this out?
Well, look, we've said that we felt that this could be sorted out with negotiation, that we had to roll up our sleeves, and just as we got the Good Friday Agreement, we could get a deal here. And so I'm pleased, of course, that finally it looks like that we might get that deal in the coming days. Worried a bit that the unionists have not been kept in the mix, but if he's able to pull off a deal, we will support it because we think it'll be an improvement on what we've got at the moment. Let's look at the detail in the coming days, but all credit to Rishi Sunak if he does that.
And would you support a deal even if the DUP, the Northern Irish Unionists, aren't happy?
Well, look, the DUP have set out 7 tests, and understandably, they will want to look at the detail of any deal as against that test. And I hope that they feel able to support a deal that Rishi Sunak
Labour
is able to.
still back it? Because their support is vital to then, for the next domino, to hopefully, many people would say, get the Stormont Assembly back up and running. So that's absolutely critical here. If the DUP don't back the deal, would Labour still back it?
Our judgment is that any deal that emerges will be better than what we've got now. I was in Londonderry a few weeks ago looking at the issues in Foyle Port. We think that they can be overcome. We've seen the discussions on green lanes and red lanes, on goods that might travel from the United Kingdom into Northern Ireland and then into the Republic of Ireland. There's already a deal on data. So it is our view that in the national interests of our country and of Northern Ireland, of getting back to Stormont as well, that it is important for Labour to lend the Prime Minister the votes to get this deal view.
But you will, but I'm hearing that it's not then a red line for you if the DUP don't back it. Labour might back it anyway, even if the Democratic Unionists don't want it.
If we determine that it's in the national interest, and I think it's likely that we will.
OK, this is the hangover from Brexit in some ways, but maybe you might fancy a bigger rethink, perhaps. You were one of the politicians recently who had a little weekend away at a beautiful stately home in Oxfordshire, Ditchley Park. I think we can show our viewers a picture of it. Now, that gathering was called How to Make Brexit Work Better. There were some top Tories there, I think, including Michael Gove. What were you all doing?
Well, Laura, Ditchley's one of our great foreign policy think tanks, and you will know that in the end, foreign policy operates in 3 zones. You've got diplomacy, where obviously people like me are careful with our language. You've got the private domain, where you're able to have robust conversations in private. And then you've got Chatham House rules. And this was a Chatham House rules forum, cross-party, which I think must be...
no one's meant to be able to say what's said, but it got into the newspapers.
Must be a good thing, where experts were there, former officials were there, former diplomats were there, where we were able to discuss the issues, what is important to the British economy and how do we move forward. And it is important to say that we have a review of the trade deal that we struck with the European Union in 2025. Labour feels that yes, we've left the European Union, yes, we're not in the single market, yes, we're not in a customs union, but these are our friends. We want structured dialogue again, and I've set that out. We think we can make progress on Horizon, the science deal that we must be part of, student mobility, issues like that, and sector by sector, let us look at the trade deal, where there's friction, and see if we can make progress with our European allies.
So you're saying very clearly, as Keir Starmer has, that you want to have a closer relationship again in some areas, and you want to look at that. But the EU always drives a hard bargain. I mean, they're not going to give you any of that without something in return. So would a Labour government be willing to give some power back, or perhaps some cash, or perhaps something in return. You've just mentioned student mobility, perhaps freedom of movement for students back to the UK. Would your Labour government be willing to give things back to the EU in return for the kind of closer relationships that you've just suggested?
Well, actually, it's the French, the Germans and others across Europe that are raising the fact that they lament and are worried about the fact that their students are not now able to come to British universities in this way. Of course it's a negotiation. Of course it's a quid pro quo. I can't set out the terms of that negotiation before we actually
but it's a
win
principal
power.
question. So you're saying, of course, Labour would be willing to give some things back for something in return.
The principles that I can set out are that we will not be returning to the single market. We will not be returning to a customs union. We have a trade deal review in 2025, and it's my sincere hope that we're able to look through sectors and deal with friction. It's in the interest also of the European Union to want to do that. All scientists are saying that we should be in Horizon. Everyone's raising the issue of qualifications, and artists can't now play in Germany and centres like that. So there are areas where Europeans are raising issues that they'd like to deal with, where, of course, we are raising issues that we'd like to do. And the important issue here, Laura, is at the moment, none of this is on the table. It's not on the table because of the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which has upset our European partners and our friends in Washington. And that's what we now need to get over.
Well, it will be an interesting few days on that particular issue, but it's been an interesting few days for Labour for all sorts of different reasons. Luciana Berger, who our viewers will remember was an MP who left the party over anti-Semitism, is back in the fold. Keir Starmer launched his 5 missions this week, which sounded rather like the Tony Blair's 5 pledges on that famous pledge card. I think for old time's sake, we can show viewers pictures of that, bring back any memories for you, David, that happened back in 1997. And now the wealthy donor, Lord Sainsbury, has opened up his very large chequebook to donate to the party again. It does seem, week after week, that your boss is not just keen on finding ways of saying to the public, Labour's changed, but also somehow of trying to wind up Jeremy Corbyn's supporters. Is that what he's doing?
No, look, none of us would have anticipated that Keir Starmer would have got us to this point after the dire night that we lived through, the general election result in 2019, the worst result since 1935 for the Labour Party, and all credit for Keir Starmer in getting us to this point.
But it has upset some people on the left of the party. He, however, is intent on making these changes, and as you've said, you think that's very important, but you once apologised for nominating Jeremy Corbyn. You said it was a mistake. Should Keir Starmer also apologise for being part of the project?
Look, the Labour Party is a socially democratic party of socialist Democrats as well, and of course of the trade union movement. At our best, we delivered progressive change. That's what Attlee did when he set up the National Health Service and moved Britain on after the Second World War. That's what Harold Wilson did with the white heat of technology, and I was very proud to be part of what Tony and Gordon Brown did. These 5 missions, growth, the highest growth in the G7. It's a major, major achievement if we deliver that. A clean power by 2030. Making progress for safer streets, on health and on education and opportunities for our... That's the ambition that Britain deserves. I'm proud to be associated with that. Of course, you want the broadest coalition to achieve government. Labour was only in power in the 20th century for 23 years. It's my job, along with Keir Starmer and all of my colleagues, Rachel Reeves and others, to deliver much, much more in the 21st, and I look forward to that.
OK, David Lammy, I think we're going to hear a lot more about those 5 missions from Keir Starmer, just as we heard about Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges. It seems that 5 is very much the number of the moment, but thanks very much for coming in. It's great to have you in the studio with us. Now, as we talked about last week, Nicola Sturgeon's decision to quit shocked the political world, maybe you too. But politics moves so fast, the SNP is already in the middle of a heated contest to replace her. 3 candidates are in the race: Kate Forbes, Ash Regan and Humza Yousaf. And it's already got quite tricky with a row over equal marriage. Humza joins us from Dundee, I'm pleased to say. Welcome to the programme. Now, your rival Kate Forbes was pilloried in some quarters by saying she didn't back equal marriage because of her Christian faith. But it's interesting this morning, the Scottish Association of Mosques has said it's been refreshing to hear someone talk about their faith, and it's disappointing that holding those views has led some to say she's not fit for office. Do you think there's been intolerance this week?
Well, look, I think what is really important is that people of faith, and I consider myself to be one, I'm a Muslim, I'm going to be fasting in Ramadan in a few weeks' time, that of course it's fine, perfectly legitimate to hold those religious views. What I've said very clearly in terms of my own position, for example, is that I don't use my faith as a basis for legislation and legislating. That's not what I think the job of necessarily policymakers is. We have to look at what we think is in the best interest of society as a whole. I've been a supporter of equality all of my life and will continue to be. And I think the SNP has done very well in attracting people to our party and our movement through the progressive agenda that we have. But also on top of that, when you're First Minister, you are First Minister for all of Scotland, and people want to know that they'll have a First Minister that won't just protect their rights, but advance their rights where possible too.
Would it be acceptable, in your view, to have a First Minister who did not believe in equal marriage?
Well, again, for me, I think the First Minister, people will look to them to ensure that they share their values. So I want somebody who is in a gay relationship, in a gay marriage, to look at me and to have faith that I would be somebody who would not think that their marriage is somehow inferior to
who does not believe in equal marriage. That's the question. Would it be acceptable, in your view, for the First Minister of Scotland to be someone who did not agree with equal marriage?
Not if they would roll back on those rights. I don't think that's acceptable. We have equal marriage now in Scotland. If they were able to disassociate their view and not let that interfere within policy making or legislating, then I think that's a different matter. But if they have already said that they would, roll back or they would vote against those rights, then what would happen, for example, if somebody brought in a member's bill, a piece of legislation to try to roll back on equal marriage? And people in our society need to know whoever's going to be their First Minister will stand up for those rights, will advance rights where possible, and make sure that there's no regression of rights. Look, I'm a minority, Laura, in this country. I've lived my whole life as a minority in this country. My rights are interdependent with other people's rights. I don't want anybody's rights to be withdrawn, to be chipped away at, because if they are done for one group of society, it'll happen for another group of society too.
But it's been a controversial few days in this leadership race already, and when it comes to equal marriage and how it was voted on in Scotland, a very senior figure in the SNP, Alex Neil, who was in charge of that legislation, he has said in public that you asked not to take part in one of the votes on equal marriage because you were facing pressure from religious figures. Is that true?
No, I mean, Alex Neil, I think it's fair to say, is backing another candidate, and the fact that this issue has been dragged up 9 years on in the midst of a leadership campaign probably tells you the motivation behind it. I've already said very clearly, I voted for the bill at stage 1. I would vote for it now. The reason I wasn't there at the stage 3 vote was because there was an unavoidable meeting with the Pakistani government because we were desperately trying to release a Scottish individual who was in jail in Pakistan on blasphemy on death row. It was really important that that individual was released. We managed to get him released, and that's why the meeting took place.
But this matters because it's about whether the public can trust what SNP politicians are saying. So you're saying to our viewers this morning that Alex Neil is not telling the truth because he wants somebody else to win the race to become First Minister. That's what you are saying.
I've been very clear on this campaign. I'm not going to sling mud at any SNP or any individuals involved in this contest or people that put their head above the parapet in the SNP. I'll leave Alex Neil to say what he wants to say.
Well, you already said he's doing it because he's got other motivations.
Well, I'm saying that the context, obviously, for his remarks is that he is supporting, another candidate. That is for him to justify why he is saying what he's saying. And I explained this issue, of course, back in 2014. That explanation, it seems by everybody to have been accepted. And 9 years on, in the heat of an election campaign, a selection campaign, people have decided to bring it back to the fore. But my record on equality, whether it's equal marriage, whether it's things like supporting the GRR, are well known.
Are you frustrated that this race has already got a bit dirty?
I think it is frustrating. There have been some issues that have dominated, like the ones that we've just been discussing, when actually I think a lot of people, not to say these issues aren't important, but a lot of people want to hear from their candidates what we can do to ease the cost of living crisis. I'll be setting some of that out in the coming days, what we can do to grow our economy. And I believe in the wellbeing economy. I think the both go absolutely hand in hand. Social solidarity and economic dynamism. What can the candidates do to further the cause of independence? That's really important, again, more now than ever before. So these are some of the issues I hope that we will get on to. But I do think it is important that people know whether the person who is going to be not just the leader of the SNP, but the First Minister of Scotland shares the values of the majority of Scotland, but equally will ensure that their rights are not just protected, but where possible, advanced.
Let's talk about your record then, because viewers in Scotland will know, but maybe not everyone in the UK will know, that you're a very experienced minister. You've held a range of jobs in the Scottish Cabinet in Holyrood, but your opponents point to some doubts about your record as well. So as Health Secretary in Scotland, by many measures, the NHS has been getting worse. And just to quote a couple of them, the target of recruiting 800 GPs, that is not on track, according to an independent report recently. And hospitals have recorded their worst ever A&E times. So why should people trust you to be First Minister when your record in running the health service in Scotland, according to your critics, is not exactly great?
Well, what I'd say is that every single health service in the entire UK is facing long waits, is facing challenges. Why? Because we were all affected by the global pandemic, the biggest shock that the NHS has faced in its 74-year history. That's true of the health service in Scotland. It's true of the health service
that is run. It's not all down to COVID, though.
I will come back. Of course, it's not all down to COVID, but it would be foolish for anybody to suggest that the global pandemic, which has been the biggest shock our health services face, has not been a significant factor. It's why in Conservative-led England, your health service, you're facing those challenges. And at Labour-run Wales, they're facing those challenges. But what's different here in Scotland? Well, what's different here in Scotland is that we have not had a single day of strikes from nurses or ambulance drivers. Why? Not down to good fortune or coincidence, but because I have reached across the table, worked with trade unions, meaningfully engaged with them, resolved dispute, compromised where necessary. And that means that our NHS staff in Scotland are actually the best paid in the entire UK. I think those are the kind of skills that could be very, very useful for the job of First Minister.
But when you look at other parts of your record, when you were Justice Secretary, violent crime went up. When you finished as Transport Secretary, things in the train service in Scotland had got so bad that the whole thing was then taken into public ownership.
First of all, on trains, I laid the groundwork for the service to go into public ownership because I believe that's a fundamental. I think it's a great. I think it's great that we have public ownership of our rail service. And of course, I was the Transport Minister that oversaw the completion of the Kuenssberg crossing, brought in under budget. As Justice Secretary, the person that announced a pardon for miners who were convicted in the miners' strike in 1984-85. I'm the Justice Secretary that brought forward and advanced further protection for domestic abuse victims. I'm the Justice Secretary that brought forward a hate crime bill that only had one other party supporting it at the introduction, but through negotiation, through discussion, through compromise where necessary, every single party, bar the Conservatives, supported the hate crime bill, which again advanced rights for minorities right across Scotland. So that's the track record that I'll be standing on. And not only that, I think I have the skills and the ability to further the cause of independence. And for me, that is going to be crucial to get us out of this union, this unequal union that is causing so much harm to our citizens.
We are short of time, but I want to ask you, though, about some of the things that Nicola Sturgeon left behind, as we've been discussing in Scotland, aren't actually in great shape. And there's a bit of a mess over something, for example, a recycling scheme where people are meant to be able to get money back if they take cans and bottles to be recycled. But some people worry they're going to be put out of business by that.
Look, for me, the deposit return scheme is an important scheme. It wasn't long ago that the world descended on Glasgow and COP27 to rededicate ourselves to tackling the climate emergency. The deposit return schemes, they operate in over 40 countries across the world. So the big operators, I think, absolutely should be held to account for those bottles, those cans that litter our streets and our beaches. What I will do, though, because I've listened to business, I've heard from small business in particular, if I'm elected First Minister, then I will exclude small businesses for the first year of operation of that scheme, because it's not the craft breweries or craft gin makers that are the ones that are causing the issue. It's the big producers that are the ones that we should be targeting.
Well, that'll be interesting to see how people react to that in Scotland. But of course, what SNP voters want to know is when could you, as First Minister, deliver independence and how?
Well, how is really, really important, because our opponents are desperate to keep us in this quagmire of process. But actually, the how, if you deal with the why, becomes inevitable. So what I mean by that is that if we increase support for independence, make it the sustainable majority, the sustained majority, because let's be honest, Laura, at the moment, there'll be one poll that'll put independence at 51%, another one at 49%. It'll fluctuate up and down. But if we create the sustained, settled will, the majority of people supporting independence, then of course those political obstacles that are put in the way by our opposition, they will crumble.
So
in
that
terms
is
of
a
the how, because the process
approach,
is
and that
very
is
important.
different then to what Nicola Sturgeon wanted, which was to treat the next general election as if it was a de facto referendum. So we're nearly out of time, but are you dropping the idea of the next election being treated as a referendum?
Well, I'm not wedded to the idea of a general election as a de facto referendum, but let me be clear. Every single election that the SNP fights under my leadership will be about the issue of independence. But I think it's right that we energise the membership, that we bring them together, that we have a series of discussions about what the route should be forward, and the leadership should act on that collective mandate. But let's not wait for a date, let's not wait for that process. Let's get out there, chap every door, pound every pavement, look people in the whites of their eyes and tell them why they need independence now. And if we get that settled, sustained majority, then independence will absolutely be inevitable.
OK, Humza Yousaf, thank you very much for coming on the programme. It's great to have you. And also the birds tweeting away in the background in Dundee. And hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll hear from the other candidates in the race too, to become a big figure in British politics, the First Minister of Scotland. Now, it is nearly 10 o'clock and our hour together has raced by, as it always does. Remember, we started this morning looking ahead to the big debate of the week. Does Rishi Sunak have the authority to drive a Brexit deal through if he gets one with the EU? This is what Dominic Raab, his number 2, has to say.
Doing the right thing the right way for all communities in Northern Ireland, protecting the Good Friday Agreement, which has come under pressure from the Northern Ireland Protocol, frankly, if you ask about the politics, fulfilling our manifesto commitment on Brexit. I think in all those 3 areas, what the Prime Minister is seeking to do as a statesman is get the deal.
Now, George, you were part of successive Tory administrations trying to ram through different versions of Brexit. You sounded quite enthusiastic about what the government might come back with, but one of your former cabinet colleagues said to me this weekend, if Rishi Sunak gets this wrong, it could actually be curtains for him. Now, is it nuts to think that?
I think we've had enough of chopping and changing leaders in the Conservative Party, and I think Rishi's made a really strong start. He's showing good judgment, and actually we should just get behind him. We've got to try and address some really serious challenges that the country faces between now and the election, and I think he's doing that well. So I don't think it's in that kind of order. But look, he's going to have to try and address the concerns that have been raised by the DUP. You know, ultimately this isn't really about the Tory Party. This is about the people of Northern Ireland and their rightful place within the United Kingdom.
We've got to make it about themselves. I mean, that's what we've seen in the last few years.
It's about Northern Ireland, and that's why, you know, coming back to some of the questions you're asking, Rishi Sunak is right to address this because it's right for Northern Ireland and they're part of the UK. OK,
we are nearly out of time as it's nearly 10 o'clock, so I am going to do something that wasn't necessarily my idea, but Thomasina, we set you a challenge. Here are some turnips. I'm not going to ask you to chop them. Dave, I'm wondering if you, as a good Scotsman, are up for, you know, turnips, mashed potato, haggis, all of that. Not that that's a stereotype at all. Thomasina, what can you do? Maybe a suggestion for Therese Coffey. What can you do with these rather lovely-looking vegetables?
First, I'd like to say, why didn't you say parsnip? I mean, there are so many delicious things you can do with parsnips, which are sweeter, nuttier, more delicious. And, you know, I've got lots of ideas which you can check on social media. Turnips can be delicious, though. And I think if you caramelise them in butter, salt and pepper, add a splash of water, cover them, couple of minutes till they're tender, they're delicious.
That sounds quite easy.
Yeah, really, and that's the thing, skills. We've got to give people the skills to cook, and then they can do anything with all our seasonal vegetables, which is better for the environment and better for people, and fun.
And fun to boot.
Yeah.
But Therese Coffey's allies say she wasn't trying to tell people what to do. She was trying to say we've all got too accustomed to too much choice. I mean, is that right? We're all too sort of fancy these days.
Well, the way we expect any ingredient to be flown in at any stage is costing the environment. It's having a diabolical effect on our biodiversity, and it's killing our soils. So yes, we should eat more seasonally, but the only reason we're going to do that is educating kids, feeding better food in schools, and thinking that real food is important, not just for fun, but for health and for climate.
OK, Dave and George, are you going to go home and steam some turnips?
I'll get the recipe from Thomasina after this show.
I'll try and work out what the difference between a turnip and a swede is.
Oh, well, well, that's a whole other debate. We don't have time for that this morning. That's a whole other programme. Thank you to my companions here at the desk. And we are looking to a really decisive few days, possibly, for the government ahead. Will the unfinished business of Brexit get done, as Rishi Sunak hopes? The old mantra on Brexit is nothing's agreed until everything is agreed. But the deal with Brussels might feel relatively straightforward for Rishi Sunak compared to a fight that might face him in his own party. Some of his wilder critics say if he gets it wrong, it could finish him. There's always, of course, Boris Johnson over his shoulder. But if the Prime Minister can sort it, it would be a massive political achievement, a moment to draw a line. Stand by, though, for a torrid few days. As ever, you can catch up with everything on iPlayer, Thomasina's turnip recipe perhaps, with anything you missed. Thank you so much for your company. Until next week.